makes me feel like I'm in church. The recording in progress and the fact that almost everyone now is sitting at the back. Yes. Well, when I drew either the short straw or the long straw, whichever it was, to secure last place, I wasn't entirely sure what my purpose was going to be here in light of the overarching theme of Sagna Skempton, the tradition of that evolved after the tradition of oral storytelling when the sagas had come to be written down and evening entertainments took the form of reading from the sagas or from the sermon books of the great preachers and from other secular literature. So I imagine you all out there with knitting in hand, perhaps, or some
You're
other
used to this.
tasks to do as evening approaches, and it is my role to entertain you to the end. I'm not entirely sure, though, if that means that I'm obliged to try to keep you awake so that you finish whatever tasks you've been working on, or if my job is actually to lull you softly to sleep so that all I hear is the sound of what our American neighbors call Z's as I leave the building. So we'll see how it works out.
We want your wisdom.
It didn't take the Icelandic settlers on the western shore of Lake Winnipeg very long after their arrival to establish a government, congregations, schools, and a newspaper. And descendants of the original settlers, along with those who came later, have been bragging about it ever since, sometimes embellishing the details and exaggerating the accomplishments. Our ancestors were storytellers and saga writers, and we have spent a millennium seeking to outdo the exploits of Njal and Egil, Freydis and Thorgerðr, at least on paper. Icelandic publishing in Manitoba, first in Icelandic and later in English, with bilingual hybrids along the way, has become one of the central characteristics that define the history of the Icelandic community in this province. This enterprise began with a single copy, handwritten newsletter that was passed from farm to farm, house to house in New Iceland. But less than 2 years after coming ashore at Willow Point, the newspaper Framfari was established at Lundi, now Riverton, and its first issue was published on September 10th, 1877. And while the paper ceased publication 31 months later, having published 75 issues, it demonstrated the value of having a forum to share news and commentary on a wide variety of topics. Before the settlers had even arrived in Manitoba, though, a party of 6 scouts, including John Taylor and 5 Icelanders, had explored the possible sites for the Icelandic Reserve. In a report on their findings, which may be the first direct account of Indigenous people in Canada written by Icelanders since the Saga Age, and which was later published as New Iceland in Canada, the delegates wrote, "When discussing fishing, we mentioned the Indians who lived around Lake Winnipeg. It should be added that a few of them live in tents and cabins near Sandy Bar. But they present no threat, as not only are they Christians and civilized, but belong to the most peaceful of tribes. As far as Indians go, there is no safer place in the West, and when the Icelanders arrive, the Indians will be moved elsewhere." Today, the delegates' report is an uncomfortable reminder of European attitudes towards indigenous people at the time, even among sympathetic Europeans. And an omen that, however Christian and peaceful they may have been, the people near Sandy Bar were about to be displaced. Today, even, we may wonder whether claiming to be a Christian and peaceful in the same breath is necessarily connected. Until very recently, the story of the Icelandic people in Manitoba has been told with little reference to the indigenous people. They have been largely absent from the narrative in both English and Icelandic, save for the occasional story that sometimes seems contrived to reinforce the image of Icelanders as good people, rather than admit that beyond fishing and some intermarriage, we don't have as many common stories to share as we might like, especially published ones. But such narratives are increasingly unsustainable. We have to place ourselves in the context of history if our stories are to be believed. For several generations, indigenous people were largely ignored by the Icelandic Canadian press. I could actually end my presentation right here, and it would be complete. But like Jerry Seinfeld, I'm going to show you just how much you can weave on the basis of nothing. The second generation, though, produced some Icelanders who began to report on their memories and their parents' and their grandparents' memories of early contact, starting to fill in a more complete picture. In exploring this issue, I focused my own attention primarily on the Icelandic newspapers published here in Manitoba. And while it is possible that more attention might have been paid to Icelandic Indigenous relations by the authors of books, my sense is that there is generally little difference to be found between the two types of publication. Indeed, Icelandic Canadian nonfiction is heavily dependent on material mined from the newspapers. So published histories of the Icelandic community in Manitoba and elsewhere in North America tend to echo the emphases found in the papers and omit what they omitted, while supplementing the stories with some oral lore that appears in many of the local histories from the last decades of the 20th century. That said, there are memoirs from the first wave of settlers, Jon Jonsson of Grund, Simon Simonson, Magnus Stefansson, Friedrich Sveinsson, and others, that contain stories about Icelandic settlers' contacts with indigenous inhabitants, some of which have been published in whole or in part. But the published versions rarely go so far as to share accounts of the conflicts that existed, as well as the success stories of neighborliness. Those we tend to continue to keep in the background, and we remain the good people of our own narrative. But back to Framfari. Framfari's purpose was to offer the Icelandic community in New Iceland advice on farming and fishing and how to adapt to the new land in which they were living. It offered instruction about how our governmental system worked, how the banks worked, how the other institutions of society functioned. And it offered news both from Iceland and from the other Icelandic settlements that already existed across the continent. This was its primary purpose, and we need to keep this in mind when we reflect upon how well or how poorly Framfari and the newspapers that followed it may have done on reporting on Icelandic indigenous contact. The first story to mention indigenous people in Framfari appeared in its third issue, pretty early on, which was devoted to Lord Dufferin's visit to Manitoba and New Iceland, which was just north of the provincial boundary at the time. The paper reported that at the crossing, that is to say, Selkirk, large numbers of Indians had come together from all directions and expressed in their own way their delight at seeing him. They painted themselves in various ways, as is customary for them on ceremonial occasions. They danced and sang or shrieked for the Governor General's entertainment. The story, which is noteworthy because it was written by an Icelander and reflects favorably overall on his indigenous neighbors, rather than reprinted from some other newspaper or the newswires, went on to say that Lord Dufferin traveled to the Lake of the Woods and then made his way down the Winnipeg River in a birch bark flotilla of canoes as far as Fort Alexander, where he waited for the SS Colville to ferry him across the lake to the royal welcome that awaited him at Gimli. 6 of the other 7 stories dealing with indigenous people in Framfari were about Native Americans who lived far from New Iceland. 4 of them featured Sitting Bull, offering relatively impartial accounts of him and his followers while endeavoring to dispel misinformation about what they were doing in Canada, since they had recently fled from south of the border. One story related a fanciful myth attributed to the Seminole, explaining the origin of the races and how each came to earn their living through their choice of tools to work with. The story, of course, elevated Europeans to the top spot, but it placed indigenous people firmly in the middle of North America's racial hierarchy at the time. Another story reported extensively on the so-called Indian War in the Pacific Northwest, stating the Indians are regarded as cruel and pitiless, but the treatment they received time and again in the hands of white men was so harsh, especially their treatment by government agents who were supposed to distribute food supplies and other items to them in return for their lands. The one local story, just one, concerned John Ramsay, an indigenous man from Icelandic River who had by this time befriended the Icelandic settlers. It is reported that Ramsay, one of the few Indians residing here in the colony and living on hunting and fishing, recently shot 4 elk and 2 bears up along the Icelandic River. And we can surmise from John Ramsay's pattern of behavior through the years that he probably shared the meat from those 4 elk and 2 bears with his Icelandic neighbors. The 16th number of the 2nd volume of Framfari, published on March 22nd, 1879, is devoted entirely to an essay by Sigtryggur Jonasson on the Dominion of Canada. In the section devoted to the people of the Dominion, he notes that the country had been settled primarily by people from the British Isles, although he acknowledged that the first European settlers were French and that they constituted a majority in Quebec. He also noted in passing that significant numbers of German and Scandinavian immigrants had settled in the United States. But his account of the people of both countries is completely silent about the continent's First Nations. They are simply non-existent in an essay that otherwise offers as comprehensive an overview of the country as is possible in the single issue of a newspaper. Then again, Framfari had already gone silent about the indigenous people before the end of his first volume. So the subsequent two volumes are silent. There's nothing at all that I can find about indigenous neighbors. After the demise of Framfari, the Icelandic immigrants were without a newspaper of their own for 3 years until Labor was launched in Winnipeg. This publication was beset with problems from the very beginning, largely owing to poor literary quality, equally poor print quality, the temperament of its editor, Helgi Jonsson, the unwillingness of better writers to contribute to it, and the precariousness of its finances. In other words, it was Truth Social in print. It ceased operations in June of 1886, heavily in debt, but not before it had devoted extensive coverage to the Northwest Rebellion. Labor did not view Louis Riel and his followers with much sympathy, and it described Riel himself as a scoundrel. At least 18 Icelandic men served in the field with the Canadian forces, and they were treated to a welcome home banquet at the Icelandic Progressive Society Hall after the conflict was over. So it seems likely that Labor's editorial policy reflected, regarding the Northwest Rebellion, enjoyed broad support in the Icelandic community, which was getting its first taste of military service just a decade after arriving in the West. It was 15 months after the closure of Labor before the first issue of Heimskringla appeared, which was joined by Lögberg about 16 months after that. Like Labor, these two publications were produced in Winnipeg, reflecting the fact that until the first decade of the settlement, Icelandic migration to Canada had shifted from being a rural phenomenon to an urban one. The process of urbanization only accelerated in the decades that followed, long before the demographic transition that occurred in the aftermath of the Second World War. In its fifth issue after commencing publication, Heimskringla carried a story that read, "Reports are coming to the government in Washington of riots among the Indians, robberies and looting in Montana. It has also been reported that the soldiers there in the West are indifferent to these riots. And it's now said that the government has ordered a force from Pembina to go west and keep the Indians in check if they become unruly, and to deal with the Canadian Indians who are said to be among the instigators of the riots." Lögberg had also first turned its attention to Indigenous people in its fifth issue, when it ran a story about a tribe in Arizona that focused on claims to longevity within that group, with one of its members claiming to be 182 years old, an improbable age despite the evidence presented. Then later that year, Heimskringla reported on the Indigenous people in Standing Rock Territory in Dakota, who had recently opposed opening the country to immigrants and had asked for a meeting with the President of the United States. About 20 stories appeared in the Icelandic weeklies in the 1880s, 3/4 of them in Heimskringla. But none of these stories concerned the Icelanders' immediate neighbors, other than the one story about John Ramsay. The closest they got was Pembina. So they didn't reflect the Icelanders' own firsthand experiences, but rather the prevailing views of the American press, although the angle of the stories appears to have been adjusted to suit the tastes of the Icelandic editors and were not as inflammatory as the stories they were based on in the American press. These three stories were typical of the accounts that appeared in the Icelandic weeklies in the 19th century, focusing either on indigenous unrest, conflict between immigrants and indigenous communities, or curiosities about indigenous life and culture. This type of coverage dominated the papers until around the time of the First World War, when the first few personal memoirs of the settlement years began to make their way into the paper. In 1916, Sigurður Julius Jonasson, the editor of Logberg, ran a story that had been told to him by Thomas Björnsson of Geysir. It concerned an encounter between Halldór Jónsson and John Ramsay, an indigenous man whose help for the Icelandic settlers is legendary. It seems that Halldór was making his way from Sandy Bar to Icelandic River. You heard this story from Nelson earlier. And he came across John Ramsay. It was the winter of the smallpox epidemic. And although neither knew the other's language, they sat down and lit a fire. It was while sitting by that fire that Halldór saw Ramsay's feet were bare. He reached into his bag and handed him a new pair of woolen socks. When Halldór returned home, John Ramsay approached on a dog sled, handing Halldór a dozen large whitefish. The two men, it said, exchanged many gifts after this and maintained their friendship as long as they lived. Such stories proliferated in the years that followed, and as often as not, they centered on the recollections of one man, John Ramsay. When it comes to Icelanders recalling their relations with indigenous people, it seems that all roads lead to John Ramsay. Well, almost all of them. In a memoir from Jón Jónsson of Grund, which wasn't published until 1942, when it appeared in the Icelandic Canadian, a claim of secondhand indigenous influence was made when Jón claimed that it was ill-tempered Tom Hillgrow who brought ice fishing to the Icelanders on Hecla Island. I was told that Tom had taught the Icelanders to fish under the ice, Jón wrote. He is supposed to have learned it from the Indians. And then the following year, Will Christensen wrote an account of the first encounter between John Ramsay and the settlers at Icelandic River, which marked a transition from the newspapers to the Icelandic Canadian in reporting on relations between the Icelanders and indigenous people. Once again, John Ramsay appeared in the story when Will quoted Dr. Oliver Björnsson, the son of Björk Peterson, the first Icelandic settler at Sandy Bar. Ramsay taught my father to thatch the house with reeds so well that it was one of the few houses that didn't leak. He also taught him to mix clay, water, and hay for plastering the walls, and this proved highly successful, Dr. Oliver recalled. Will Christensen concluded that altogether he proved helpful, hospitable, honest, and reliable. Nearly 75 years after the arrival of the first settlers, the Icelandic Canadian emerged as the primary vehicle for telling stories about contacts between the two groups. And few have done more to perpetuate the memory of John Ramsay than Guðmundur Jove Guttormsson, whose address at Landnámshátíð in Nysa in 1951, which was published in Logberg, drew attention to the special relationship that the settlers in northern New Iceland had with him. Guttormur said, "Here Lake Winnipeg was full of fish. Meat was only available from the Indians to barter. I remember the number of people who were given free access to an abundance of dried elk meat owned by the Indian John Ramsey. He often shared his wealth of food and kindness with the Icelanders, as cheerful and majestic as the god Manitou. It is believed that the settlers learned from him how to fish for food through the ice. Others later learned to shoot animals, although the forest was full of game. This was peak indigenous influence in the Icelandic press. However, there was an explosion of interest about half a century ago when the Icelandic community marked its centennial, having marked the centennial of Canada and the centennial of Manitoba. This triple centennial that occurred over the space of just 8 years unleashed an interest in Icelandic indigenous relations that had not been found prior to this in the Icelandic Canadian press. Now, this newfound interest and the longing to be seen positively, which is always at the heart of how Icelandic Canadians write about their story. This has led to considerable romanticism, and today it can be difficult to separate myth from reality, to know whether we're dealing with history and firsthand accounts, or if we are in the midst of a process of mythologizing. It seems strange to me that only one Indigenous person and perhaps 2 or 3 minor figures reoccur repeatedly within our stories of Indigenous contact. Surely there were others, many others, whose stories have either been lost or whose stories are buried perhaps somewhere in this building, in the collection of documents that have been accumulated from those who have left their diaries and memoirs to the safekeeping of the Icelandic collection. I want to be clear. The story told in the newspapers was not incorrect. It was just incomplete. What's visible in the ink of our publications, which are as legendary as John Ramsey, what's visible in that ink now requires our imagination and our diligence to unearth the stories that have been untold, the stories that remain hidden. You see, we are responsible for curating our own stories, but our own stories are best when we provide the richest context to understand them. And that means that the story of Icelandic Canadians and Icelandic Americans will be forever incomplete until we weave the fabric of our relationships with Canada's and America's first people into the stories that we tell about ourselves.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any comments or questions they'd like to offer up?
My story.
Well, I know we're getting very late in the day, so
Yeah,
that's
now
understandable.
This is how Sagna Skempton works.
That's true, yes. Yeah,
I just, like in my family, that they were friends with all the indigenous people. They were called Indians, but they were just friends, and but then the government would come down with something, and my Icelandic couldn't read the English stuff, so they didn't really know what this was happening, and the other people didn't either, and so all of a sudden they weren't talking to them,
yeah.
and they couldn't understand, why is this happening? They would trade. My relatives made shoes, and they traded shoes, for example, out of the pig. And things like that, just real things like the socks and the, and the fish.
Yeah.
And
I,
those beautiful things happen.
I think it's also the case that people naturally tell stories about those closest to them orally.
Yeah,
I mean, how many of us have written down the stories of our parents or our grandparents or even our siblings about our relationships with them? Those things we entrust to an oral tradition. But if a generation later, the people who've heard those stories don't write them down, then they become lost forever. And so it may well be that the absence of stories, because let's face it, the stories that appear in newspapers are shamelessly self-promotional. They cover big public events in the community. They deal with financial and political matters, but they rarely tell you how Gudrid felt about Bjartni or about how we interacted with our neighbors. And in some cases, and I can say this as the editor of Logberg Heimskringla, I too often encounter people who don't submit a story because it isn't purely Icelandic, as if that's the only thing that Logberg Heimskringla should be covering, purely Icelandic stories. What could possibly be duller than that? If we aren't actually talking about our interactions in the much broader society. But those are the stories that tend to get left out. And I think sometimes it's actually intimacy that gets in the way of stories being shared publicly.
I think Curtis had a question first. Yeah.
Yeah, you did mention that there was promotional material presented to the potential immigrants. And later in your talk, you said that some of the information that we seek is probably in the diaries that are in the bowels of this institution. I've often wondered, though, what my great grandfather thought of or was aware of in terms of an indigenous population when he got on the boat in 1874. And even when he arrived, would he have had any perception at all of land being taken for their purposes?
I suspect that never would have occurred to the group of 1875. It might have occurred to the large group of the following year and to subsequent groups of people because of reporting back to Iceland about indigenous uprising and conflicts here in North America. Once the immigration started, these kind of stories made their way back to Iceland. And to its credit, the Icelandic Canadian press mostly minimized that kind of story. They took the position of, we're safe here, our indigenous neighbors are good, we needn't worry about them, we need to figure out how to get along with them. But as was mentioned this morning, both by Nelson and LK, there were geographic proximities that determined how much Icelanders had to do with indigenous people. So it's very clear that if you settled in northern New Iceland, which is Noosa, Geysir, Lundi, now Riverton, Hekla Island, you had more contact with indigenous people than if you settled in Arnus or Gimli or Husavik, which are not all that far away today, but were too long a walking journey in the 1870s and 1880s. So almost all of the stories of Icelandic indigenous contact come from northern New Iceland, not from southern New Iceland. And then that grows once the Icelandic community encounters encounters indigenous people in the fishing industry. When they're on the lake together, contact increases. When the Icelanders then migrate to places like Siglunes, the Narrows, and Reykjavik, and on to Winnipegosis, in those places you start getting intermarriage and at least friendships in the neighborhood, if nothing else. And then once you're in northern Canada, as Icelanders migrate to work in forestry and in mines, you have even more contact. The publishing emphasis, though, moved from New Iceland to Winnipeg, the urban environment, where, as LK pointed out, we actually, the polite way to put it is that we became honorary British in the fabric of Canada. But it was actually in Winnipeg that Icelanders became full participants in the colonial project. And that shift was complete by 1882. So the first people arrive in 1875. By 1882, there are more Icelandic immigrants living in Winnipeg than all of the rural settlements in Canada and the United States combined. So within that first decade, Icelandic immigration becomes an urban phenomenon with Winnipeg at the heart of it.
That's interesting.
Yes,
It's interesting, you hear all these stories about John Ramsey and how he was, and the coming to Sandy Bar, but yet. His wife's and kids' gravesite is there, but there's no indication of it. Unless you know where it is.
Right.
You can't find it.
Right.
But there's nothing at Sandy Bar indicating that was one of the first landing sites in that area. And I know
Yeah.
because I live up there.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to hear about John Ramsey. But yet it's not represented as how significant that area really is to
Right.
the Icelandic and the indigenous history.
It's the stuff of local lore. Part of the problem, of course, is that it is an enclave on a piece of private property,
Yes, it is.
which makes it
Mhm.
difficult. But yeah, you could imagine a sign
Yeah,
somewhere along the grid road
yeah,
that at least points to the significance and has a spyglass there
yeah,
to look through to it.
yeah.
I have to say, when Oscar was talking this morning about the Viking statue, which I'm sure I'll hear about it from somebody that I said something unkind. But imagine if the monument at Gimli was John Ramsey and Oliver Olafsson from Espeholt standing side by side working together.
Mhm.
I mean, what could be a more compelling monument to the reality of the Icelandic community in New Iceland than that, rather than a kind of a hokey fiberglass sculpture that represents who Icelanders aren't, and in all honesty, probably never were. I actually think the correct reading of ancient Icelandic history is that the people who settled Iceland were refugees from Vikingism, not Vikings.
Yeah,
And that if we would claim that story for ourselves, we would have a better history.
yeah. And I think part of cause I grew up in Riverton, I grew up in the area. I remember my family hunting in that field. We knew where the gravesite was.
Yeah,
And I remember the landowner plowing around it.
yeah,
But as far as knowing who that was, it wasn't something that was popularly talked about.
right.
And you see, and this is just my experience, but you see a heavy Icelandic influence in Gimli. And it kind of goes down and then goes back up again in Hekla. So it's like almost like Nasa, Arnis, Riverton's a little more, But it's not until you get to Hecla that you start seeing this Icelandic pride again. So it's kind of,
That's
and
right.
I often wonder why that is, why there's, this pride in Gimli and this pride in Hecla. And then it just kind of peters out in between the two.
Part of it is demographics.
Yeah.
Part of it is just the consequences
Mhm.
of time. I actually think, I mean, I grew up in the St. James neighborhood in Winnipeg, and I never escaped it. And I grew up as part of an early family
Uh-huh.
in the neighborhood. And what was recited for us was the stories of the Hudson Bay Company Métis settlers who lived on the river lots along St. James. My mother made me memorize names and who lived where and why the families were significant. And now my family is not Métis,
Mhm.
not my mother's family, not my father's family, but my mother used to kind of impress upon me the need to first learn the history of where you are,
Mhm.
to learn what's significant in your local context,
Mhm.
and then consider what's significance to your tribe, if you
Yeah.
will, and learn what's significant in the larger world. But to begin with your neighborhood
Mhm.
and to cherish, celebrate, learn
Yeah.
the history of that neighborhood,
Mhm.
whoever's history you
Yeah.
think it is.
I think our Riverton Elementary School was probably the only school in the Evergreen School Division that actually had Icelandic as one of our classes.
Hmm.
And I took Icelandic in elementary school, so when I got to high school and had to learn French, I couldn't do it. Cause everything came out Icelandic. And so,
All right, well, we're a little past the end of our scheduled time. Does anyone else have any questions or anything they'd like to add? All right, well, please join me in thanking Stefan Jonasson. Thank you very much. And